Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for another exciting edition of Science Division Live. My name is Talia. I'm the Virtual Experiences Coordinator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and I am connected via Zoom today to Catherine Reusch, who is a conservation technician in our Science Division. Today, Catherine's going to be telling us about some of her work in the Conservation Department at the museum, and specifically about fun and science that she gets to do with pine cones, or I guess more broadly, conifer cones. And not only is she telling us some science behind these incredible cones, she's also going to be sharing with us some experiments and activities that you can do in your very own home. So we hope that you're excited to tune in and watch today. And again, thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't already done so, leave us a comment to let us know where you're watching from today. And if you have any conifers like pines or spruces or firs in your yard or around your neighborhood, we would love to know, because again, these are going to be experiments and activities today that you can try in your very own home. I will be watching the stream the entire time today on my handy dandy device. So again, leave us those comments and I will be able to pull your questions, your comments, your observations to share with our expert on camera. Without any further ado, Catherine, I'm going to kick it over to you. How are you doing today? Tell us about these incredible conifer cones.
I'm doing great today, thanks, Talia. I am a conservation technician at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And so what that means is I help repair and study some of the artifacts that come through the museum and that need a little bit of tender love and care to get them kind of into a stable condition. And one of the things that we've been doing is actually for the last about year and a half, we've been working with the Earth Sciences Department in the Science Division to figure out a way to preserve the conifer cones that were excavated at the Snowmass excavation that was held in Snowmass Village, or just outside Snowmass Village, up near Aspen about 10 years ago. And basically when they were excavating, they found a lot of faunal remains, a lot of animal remains, but within that, they also found about 200 or about 100 intact conifer cones from about 4 different species that are actually 3 of them are still native in Colorado today. And these conifer cones are actually telling us a lot about what the environment was like around that area about 70 to 130,000 years ago. So they're actually really, really important artifacts to have. But they've kind of been sitting in jars of water for the last 10 years because the site was waterlogged, which means that everything was really wet. And so to keep them preserved, they were kind of cleaned off and then put into these jars of water and put in a fridge to keep them in kind of the same condition they came out of the ground in. But now that they've got all of the animal bones kind of sorted out from Snowmass, they're turning to the floral remains, the cones and stuff, and they've asked conservation to help them come up with a way to preserve the cones so that they can come out of the jars of water, so they're a little bit easier for scientists to study who want to come and kind of understand the evolution of conifers and kind of changes in environment in the mountains here in Colorado. And so what we've been doing is running some experiments on some modern cones to try and figure out what is the best chemical solution we can use to help stabilize the cones, because their structure is a little bit weakened and damaged after 70 to 130,000 years underground. And so what we're talking about today is some of the fun things that we've learned about conifer cones since we started this project. And so one of the big things that I wanted to start with is why am I saying conifer instead of pine? And that's actually because pines are part of a bigger kind of group of trees. And so conifers is kind of the big overarching group term. So all pines are conifers, but not all conifers are pines. And conifer just really refers to a tree that creates a cone. So conifer just literally means cone bearing. So any tree that creates a cone like this, or, a smaller one, a little more scaly one like this is a conifer tree. And so you're probably familiar with conifers. We have about 11 different native species in Colorado, including the blue spruce, which is our state tree. And so those are really popular to plant in especially the neighborhoods around Denver. I know we've got at least 5 or 6 different varieties of conifer in my neighborhood. Do you have different conifers in your neighborhood? And if you do you know what conifers you have? It's a fun thing to do, your afternoon walk. go out and kind of just look at the different cones and trees that are in your neighborhood. And just kind
we do have one comment from a watcher saying that they have evergreen trees in their neighborhood, including ponderosa pines and cedars. And
Ooh,
I know
wow.
I personally have a lot of ponderosa pines on my street, as well as in people's yards, some blue spruce.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I know we've got a number of blue spruce in my neighborhood. I know we've got some pines. So yeah, some of the trees that we do have in Colorado are blue spruce, bristlecone pine, Douglas fir, Engelmann spruce, limber pine, lodgepole pine, pinyon pine, ponderosa pine, Rocky Mountain juniper, subalpine fir, and white fir. So that's a whole bunch of different spruces and pines and firs. It's really interesting you've got cedar actually, because we don't actually have cedar native to the state. So that must have been an import. So I'm really curious to see how that's doing here, because I wouldn't have thought we were wet enough for cedar. Because I think cedar likes to be pretty wet. But yeah, so yeah, there's lots of different trees around your neighborhood. And if you know what you've got, yeah, definitely let us know, because that's always really fun to see who's got what in their neighborhoods. So I'm just going to switch on screen sharing and show you from, I've got a whole bunch of different cones sitting here on my table.
That's right. So we're going to switch over so that we can view Catherine's iPad camera. She's going to be showing us some cones that she has from lots of different species. And yeah, in the meantime, if you haven't done so, let us know where you're watching from. I see a couple of highs from Sarah and from Christy. Let us know where you're watching from. And if you do have any conifer species in your neighborhood, we would love to know.
All righty, so I've got the screen up now. So you can see I've got a couple different cones sitting out on the table. And I've got a few different examples of branches. So yeah, conifers are basically one of the groups of trees that we call evergreen trees. And so those are ones that normally have these kind of needly leaves. The needles come in different shapes and sizes. We've got ones that are a little bit more like these needles, where they're a little bit shorter, rounder, a little bit more, they look almost like very, very fine, thin leaves. And that's spruce and fir tend to have ones like that. So this is a branch of, I believe, blue spruce needles. Sorry, let me get that so you can actually see them. So yeah, these are blue spruce needles, and that's why it's called blue spruce, because you can see the needles are green, but they're kind of a bluey green. And so this is, again, our straight state tree. And it's really, really popular, especially as kind of like an ornamental tree in people's yards, because they're really, really pretty. They have that kind of sort of almost dreamy blue-green color, which makes them really, really attractive in people's yards. So blue spruce is another really popular conifer. And then we also have, these are kind of dried up, but these are what pine needles look like. And you can see they're a little bit longer, a little bit thinner, and they kind of have, rather than coming directly off the branch, like some of the fir and spruce needles, they actually have a little bunch, they bunch up at the bottom here. And then this bit right here is actually what attaches to the tree branch itself. So you can tell different conifer species by their needles and also by their cones, which is really kind of what we're looking at right now. So I have a few different types of cones here. I've got this one, which is a fir cone, I believe. I'm not 100% on the identification. I'm not a plant expert. But I believe this is a fir cone, and you can see it's got these kind of, they're really scaly looking. These bits here are actually called scales. The little individual parts of a cone are called scales, and they just have these really fun, again, scaly appearance, really lovely, really smooth. And then it comes up to the stem up here. So that's a fir scale, or a fir cone. This is kind of what you would think of as your traditional pine cone. These are what you see at Christmas time and that kind of thing. And so that's really, when people think of cones, they think of pine cones generally. And it's these kind of thicker, slightly more wood-looking scales. And so that was one of the first things we actually learned when we were doing this project, is that these scales are actually, they're very wood-like. Quite frequently, even the ones that are a little bit thinner and finer are wood-like, but they're not exactly woody. their cellular structure is different from a piece of wood. And that's actually one of the really important things for us, because that's controlling how the chemicals that we're adding to help stabilize the cones actually come into the cones. So that's a typical pine cone. And then this last little one, which I think you can see, I hope I'm not shaking too much. This is what we call juniper berries. And the berries are actually the cones of the juniper bushes, juniper trees. So you can see here, you can kind of just see the edge of a scale here. So if you go out and you pick up some juniper berries and you look at them really closely, you can actually see the scales of the juniper cones. So we call them berries because they look like berries, but these are actually like a pine cone or like a fir cone. They're cones. So that's actually how the juniper releases its seeds. And so the reason that the structure of cones is so different is actually because conifers have seeds like this. So you can see you've got a fairly small seed, I hope you can see, a fairly small seed like this, and then it's got these wings that are kind of long and kind of like a helicopter blade. And so those actually, when the cone is open, the wind comes by and catches these wings and sends the cones out into the environment and allows them to kind of fly further away from the parent tree. Because if the seeds all fell at the base of the parent tree, they wouldn't get a lot of light, they wouldn't get a lot of nutrients, and they wouldn't grow really well. And so this is actually, the cones are actually a really clever way of the parent tree dispersing its seeds. So let me show you on my pine cone back here. There we go.
We do have a comment from Christy saying, yes, we can see the seeds. So it sounds like the audience is seeing everything really nicely. It does look really good.
Excellent. I am so glad to hear that.
And hi to all of the viewers chiming in to let us know where they're watching from. Thanks, everybody. Back to Catherine.
Thank you. Okay, so hopefully you can see here on my cone, this is actually a seed in place. So each of these scales on your cone has two seeds per scale. So you can see this one here is kind of on this side, and then it would have a partner on the other side, but the seed has fallen out. So you can see when it's nice and open like this, it's really easy for the wind to come in and pick up that seed and catch that wing and take it away. Now, if I were to take a cone and put it in a jar of water, do you see my bowl? Okay. If I take a cone and put it in a container and put some water on it, I'm going to leave this here kind of on the screen, and we'll see, hopefully over time, hopefully the rim is not in the way, we'll see that over time that cone is going to close up. And so the reason this happens is actually, and it'll take about 10 minutes maybe, so till the end of the show, to kind of close up. But the reason this happens is because, hopefully my hand comes into the shot soon. My computer might have frozen the screen sharing. Yep.
No big deal. We can have you unshare and then reshare.
Yes.
We could see the cone pretty well. I might recommend that you scoot the cone within the bowl a little closer to the camera. But while we get that done, we have a lot of folks watching us today from all over the place, including all across Colorado, New Mexico. Bill says, aloha from Honolulu. Zoe asks about Nebraska. So Zoe may be in Nebraska. We have Minneapolis, Minnesota, lots of different people. So while we get that screen sharing back up, aloha and hello. So happy to have you all on with us. And perhaps we can hear a little bit about conifers in Nebraska a little bit later. All right, there we go.
There we go. Back in business. Excellent. Okay, so I'm just gonna quickly pop over that conifer in that cone in the bowl and show you, this is a cone that I have cut in half. You can do this for some of the experiments we're going to talk about, but be very, very careful. Wear gloves when you're cutting it, and maybe a small saw. This is definitely a 2 adult assisted thing. Don't do it on your own, and definitely don't let your children do it, because the cones, you can see here, they actually have a really strong kind of central stem, which makes them really hard to cut through. So you could, and they're round so they can roll on you. So please do this with two people, two adults. Don't let a child do it, and don't do it on your own just for fear of cutting yourself. But you can see they have this really strong central stem, and then we've got these kind of radiating, these are actually the ends of the scales radiating out from that central stem. And so this kind of darker wooden bit is a slightly more loose cellular structure, and then the lighter wooden bit just to the side of it that's coming out into the scales is a more dense woody bit. And so this is actually, when the cones get wet, the water comes into these kind of denser cells, and they immediately start to swell, and that causes the cones to close up, and that traps and protects the seeds in the spaces underneath the scales, and helps protect them and keep them close and keep them inside the cone when it's wet. So when it rains, when it's a particularly humid day, that kind of thing, you'll find that the cones will kind of close up more as you have them, as they get wet. And that's to protect those seeds and keep the seeds inside, so that when it's a dry day, the cones can open back up and allow those seeds to disperse. So this is actually one of those really interesting things we learned that we hadn't ever really thought about or known about, before we started really undertaking this research. Is, why do cones open and close? You can see it if you're just taking a walk on a rainy day. You can see the cones get really closed up, but we had never really thought about why that might be. So that's actually one of the really fun experiments that you can do with a cone, is actually take and just pop a whole bunch of different cones into water, like our pine cone here. I'll add one of our fir cones as well. They don't have to be completely submerged in water. You can completely submerge them. You can partially submerge them. You can do all sorts of fun things like that. Another fun thing that you can do, I'm just going to scooch this bowl back and away a little bit to show you this. Another fun thing you can do is you can take a cone that's been sliced in half. Again, please be very, very careful when you do that. It's very, very dangerous. You can hurt yourself. But what you can do is add a couple of drops of food coloring, and I would recommend liquid food coloring, not gel. We tried it with gel food coloring, and it didn't seem to work very well. But just like a regular bottle of liquid food coloring, and add a little bit of water. And please excuse my cat in the background. And that's sort of not helped us because I've dunked the side of the cone. But if you can get it to stay upright in the corner of your container, you can add a little bit of food coloring, and then you can actually sit there and watch it. You can actually watch how the food coloring will actually soak up into the structure of the cone over time. And you can actually see how and why, now my cone won't stay up, of course. But you can actually see how this structure of the cone affects how it takes up water. And so this is actually something we did to help us understand how our cones, our experimental cones, were going to take on the chemical solutions that we were going to be putting them in, to try and understand exactly how that was going to work, and maybe help us choose a better chemical solution for our cones. So I don't know how much time we have left, Talia.
I think you said you have one more thing to show us about humidity. Is that correct?
Yes, one more thing to show about humidity.
We have a comment from Bird Bear saying, oh, okay, that's cool to know. So cones are indicative of humidity. I think that might have been in response to your comment that cones change their shape whether it's raining or not raining. So
yeah, they're a really good indicator of humidity, actually, which is what I am going to.
Go Bear.
Sorry, I forgot one item on my table I didn't have ready. So the last thing I'm going to show is actually a really fun experiment that you can do, and we have a link which can kind of explain this a little bit better. You can actually make yourself a little hygrometer for conifer cones. And so what you can do is you just take a piece of graph paper and a clipboard, And I'm gonna scooch my bowls again. Sorry, everybody, you only have so much camera space. But I am going to, you can take your piece of graph paper and if you put it on a clipboard, and then if you have a cone with a fairly flat bottom, like this, where you can see it's got a fairly flat bottom, you should be able to stand it upright on a flat surface. You can take that cone and put it up against a piece of graph paper, and then the link that we've got says put a pin in the end of one of the scales. You can also just take the scale and kind of measure around. You can see I've already got some black marks on my page here. You can kind of measure where some scales are. And then if you record what the date is and what the humidity was at the time that you made those initial marks, you can then come back to it the next day and kind of make some more marks and say, okay, this is what the humidity was on those days. And so you can then, if you do that for a couple days, you'll then have calibrated, oh, when the cones are more up like this, the humidity is more likely to be, say, 50% humidity versus, when they're more open, oh, the humidity is maybe more like 15% today. And so you can actually have a kind of homemade measurement of what the local humidity is around your house, inside your house or outside your house. I mean, you could set it up so you have one outside your window and one just inside your window, and actually get an idea of what your different humidity is inside versus outside too, which is kind of fun. And you don't have to have, super fancy equipment to do it. So that's kind of the last sort of fun experiment that I had to show you, I think.
Supremely cool. And those links that Catherine is referencing, everyone, we will pop those in the comments when the broadcast ends. So stay tuned. We'll get those to you. But yes, lots of fun science experiments that you can do at your home. I do see a couple of comments from people who maybe are teachers or have friends who are teachers who are saying, oh, this could be really useful in class next year. So who knew? Going on a walk and finding some conifer cones could lead to a world of discovery. I have been staying sane throughout these past several months of working at home and not leaving my house very much by going for walks frequently with a mask on, of course. And I'm now going to be looking at all of the conifers and trees in my neighborhood in a whole different way. That's fabulous. Yeah. Thank you for changing my perspective a little bit.
You're
we do
welcome.
have time for a few questions, so I'd like to pull those now if you're ready for them. And yes, as a note to the audience, you are more than welcome to pass any comments and any questions that you have along right now. We will take as many as we have time for. All right, let's see. Sarah is wondering, what's up with the wild, over-the-top cone growth going on this year in several species? I think Sarah has noticed there's been a lot of cone production in certain species this year. Any ideas?
That might be because we have had a couple of really wet years. So cones take about, so the first thing is the cones that we think of as cones are actually the seed, or what are called female or seed cones. So we have two different types of cones on trees. We have, I'm just going to hold this up to my camera. That is what's called a male or pollen cone. And then what we think of as traditional cones, these are the female or seed cones. And so about this time of year, you've probably noticed there's a lot of like yellow kind of powder in the gutters after it rains. That's actually conifer pollen. And in fact, the bag that I collected all of these in, you can actually see I have bright yellow pollen.
Oh, that makes me want to sneeze just looking at it.
Yeah. And I have a bit of an allergy to conifers, which is a little unfortunate. But yeah, so that's kind of the first thing, is like those waves of yellow clouds you get when it gets really windy around here. That's the conifer pollen. And so, yeah, we've got a lot of male, like, and you'll see the seed cones tend to be on the tips of branches so that they catch the wind really nicely. So as I was walking around collecting cones yesterday, yeah, I was like, yeah, there are a lot of male cones and there are also a lot of female cones out there. And I think part of that might be because it's been wet the last couple of years. So cones grow on about a 1 to 2 year cycle. It takes about an entire year to 2 years, depending on the tree, for a cone to get all the way to a mature cycle. So like they start out as kind of little baby cones like this, and then they get bigger and expand. And so I think because we've had a couple of wet years, the trees really had a chance to kind of grow and produce more cones. In the same way that the deciduous trees, the trees with the lovely leaves that turn in the fall, those have had a lot more leaves the last couple of years too. And I think that's just because it's been so wet that the trees have been like, yes, we've got a lot of food, we've got a lot of water, we can produce a lot of material. So I think that's probably why we have. I'm not 100% because again, I'm not a plant
A
expert. I
well-reasoned
think that's
guess for sure.
probably why.
Very good. Let's see what we've got. So Zoe asks a question about what conifer species would Nebraska have? I wonder if Zoe is watching from Nebraska.
I think so. I'm honestly not sure. I think conifers tend to like slightly more elevated areas, which is why we have so many here in Colorado with the mountains. Um, we do have a few that like kind of more dry and low, kind of wetter and more lowland areas, but that's one of the things conifers tend to like being a little bit drier, I think. So Nebraska might be too wet. I'm honestly not sure. I got the list of Colorado native trees off of the Colorado government website. So it might be best to Google uh, Google the Nebraska State website, and they should have some information on.
Yeah, usually state departments of parks and wildlife have really good surveys of all the different species. So that's a good one. A question from Bill wondering what tree is the most fire resistant? And I figured we would get a question at some point about fire and conifers. There's an interesting relationship there.
Yeah. I'm honestly not sure, but that same list, which is in the list of links that we're going to post
And I believe
to the
you had it up
Colorado.
to this point, so you should be able to see it now, everyone watching at home.
Yeah, so that I think the first link on there should be to that Colorado. Yeah, it's the CSFS colorostate.edu webpage or website. Actually has a link to all of the native tree species in Colorado, and it does actually go through and it lists, what where they like to grow and kind of at what elevations, how much water, what kind of fruits they put out, and so the cones are actually considered fruits. So that's where you'll find the information on that. And they do actually say, how resistant the trees are to fire. And I was looking through it, and I know they said one or two of the conifers are actually pretty resistant because they have a lot of resin. But we actually, yeah, speaking of conifers and fire, that was one of the other things is a lot of people think, oh, well, cones only open in the presence of fire. But that's actually only some conifer cones. And those are what are called serotinous cones, or ones that have a lot of resin in them. And the resin kind of seals the cone shut. So a fire then melts that resin and allows the cones to open. And we actually only have one species of conifer that does that here in Colorado. The rest of them react to humidity, and their cones open and close kind of naturally in humidity. And so the only species that actually their seeds are released by heat exposure is the lodgepole pine. And all of the other conifer species in Colorado, as far as I could tell, are like the pines and these other cones we've talked about today. They open and close in relation to water rather than rather than fire. So I can't remember exactly which species is the most resistant to fire, but I do know that Colorado State website will actually let you know which ones are better resistant to fire than others.
Very good. Now we are coming up to the end of our time. Would you like to show us the pine cones that have been soaking for a few minutes and see if there's any change? And we may not need to share screen. Maybe you could just.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Let me hold them up. So they haven't closed as much.
They may just need a little more time.
May need a little bit more time, but I generally find within 10 to 20 minutes they close quite a bit. So it's a fun, fairly fast experiment, and you can always come back and look at them, when you're doing your own multiple times. So that is.
It definitely looks sleeker.
Yeah, and so that's what a dry cone looks like.
Oh, look at that! There has been a big change.
So you can see, so that's the kind of spruce fir cone. And then our, try not to drop the cone, our more pine cone, that's it starting to close, and that's what an open one looks like.
So maybe not all the way closed, but those results are still pretty dramatic.
Yep. Yeah. So it's really interesting. And you can even, if you're interested and you've got the equipment, you could set up like your camera phone. If you've got a little stand on your phone, you can set up your camera phone and just kind of record, take a 5-10 minute video recording, and just kind of, you can speed it up and you can actually see the cones closing up. It's a really fun little thing to do if you've got the time and the equipment to do it.
In fact, if anyone watching today does do that, if you do manage to take a time lapse of doing this experiment at home, you can post it on social media with the hashtag DMNS Science Party, and we will see it, and that will just make our days. You're also welcome to send it to us directly at the DMNS Facebook page. You can send us a private message. So if you do it, we would love to see it. Science.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. Let us know, because it's always fun to see it happening. And yeah, it's lots of fun experiments to do with kids. And one of the links that we're posting is going to have about 8 to 11 science experiments you can do with kids with cones. And that includes collecting them, looking at the trees, and then also having fun with the cones themselves with water, which I find kids always love to do because it's splashy. If you do it, especially with the food dye, I would recommend using a table. You don't care if it gets messy, or laying down some newspaper or something, because it does get a little bit messy.
Yeah, I mean, science is messy, right? That's
Exactly.
how you have to do it. All right, that is all the time we have, everybody. So we do have to wrap up and say goodbye, but I do want to say a huge thank you to Catherine for sharing your expertise. Again, I'm not going to think about pine and conifer cones the same way ever again. So thanks for blowing my mind a little bit. And a big thanks to all of you who tuned in on Facebook today to ask us your questions, leave us some comments. It was great to have fun and learn along with all of you. So stay healthy, stay curious, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.